An unexpected education. You will have to forgive me, Miss Carlton, Masefield said as she and Lydia sat before their afternoon tea. The Duchess was a gentle elderly woman who had taken a liking to Edgar and looked out for him like she would a grandson. Shortly after arriving in Britain, he had been seen cozying up to her to help establish himself as an earl in the aristocracy, but as she had been treating him as family since then, Lydia supposed she didn't consider herself to have been manipulated. Or perhaps it was down to the Earl's expertise with women. Edgar had been open with the Duchess about the girl he had set his heart on and had asked her to act as a guardian of sorts to Lydia even before the pair had officially been engaged. That was why the fairy doctor had been staying at the Duchess's estate to learn how to be a lady for 3 days now. I have yet to teach you anything, and here I am sending you off to another estate by yourself where you don't even know a soul. Please do not worry, madam. I was due to go next week regardless. The original plan had been for both of them to travel to the noblewoman's estate. Apparently, she had a well-established reputation for teaching young ladies how to behave in proper company, and Masefield had felt that Lydia would benefit from a brief period under her care. However, the Duchess had received news this morning that her eldest daughter had suddenly been taken ill, and she now needed to travel to Derbyshire to see her. There was no telling when Masefield might be back in London, and it wasn't as though she could leave Lydia in the lurch for all that time. So the plans had been moved up, and Lydia would be going to train under the reputable noblewoman almost at once. Lady Ortred is both uncomplicated and kind. She expressed in her letter that she would be delighted to have you, and I am sure that the same will hold true even if you must see her a little earlier. Yes, madam. Please do not overly concern yourself with me. I only pray that your daughter will recover quickly. Thank you, Miss Carlton. I shall send her ladyship a telegram as soon as possible. May I ask that you be ready to travel to Somerset tomorrow? Somerset was a county in the west of England and far removed from London. It struck Lydia that she wouldn't be seeing Edgar for some time. That said, she hadn't seen him since she had lashed out at him over the proposed audience with the Queen. He would have known that she was at the Duchess's estate. Ever since she had accepted his proposal, he had shown up uninvited at her house every single day, even on the Sabbath. There must have been a reason that he wasn't doing the same here. Maybe he had decided that it was best to give her some time to clear her head. Lady Ortred's recommendation should make it easier for you to obtain an audience with Her Majesty, Miss Carlton. It would behove you to make a good impression. Lydia's head shot up. It was obvious now that she thought about it, but of course Edgar had discussed her establishment in noble society with the Duchess. No wonder Masefield was determined to see her education through, even if it meant sending her to another estate. Having Lydia meet with the Queen was no mere whim on Edgar's part. He had no intention of changing his mind. That was why he hadn't come running to console her. Again, Lydia was reminded that she was marrying into nobility. She was marrying an earl. The question wasn't whether it would shame him to marry a girl from the upper middle class. Rather, she had no choice but to put in the effort required to blend into the aristocracy. If she didn't, there would be no place for her by Edgar's side. Unless he decided that he would keep his title but step back from high society in order to be with her, she would have to be the one to overcome the class barrier between them. I shall do my utmost. Lydia was surprised by the note of determination in her voice. For all she knew, all of this was beyond her. Masefield smiled brightly. That is wonderful to hear. Oh, one more thing. It concerns your escort to Somerset. Since I shall be travelling to Derbyshire, I am a little short of hands. I shall be perfectly all right travelling alone, in that case. She often travelled by herself from her Scottish hometown to London, after all, and the capital to Somerset was a much simpler journey. The Duchess gently dismissed the notion. I have taken charge of you, Professor Carlton's most precious daughter. It would be remiss of me to send you off alone, especially when you are unmarried. It just so happens that a maid of mine is transferring to Somerset, so I shall have her accompany you to Lady Ortred's estate. Lydia realized that no matter how used to taking trains alone she was, it wasn't a fact to be shared with other people. Lord Ashenbert confessed to me that he is perfectly content with you just the way you are, Miss Carlton. He has not entrusted you to me that I might change you. You simply need to learn the behavior required in certain situations. It isn't that you are not permitted to travel alone, but you must learn how to conduct yourself flawlessly around those with whom you are less acquainted. That is what it comes down to. Yes, madam. The problem was that the idea of being flawless sounded rather daunting. She wondered whether she could manage it. What if Lady Ortred took a disliking to her? When she tried to quash her anxiety, she found herself longing all the more to see Edgar before she left. But she hesitated to go and meet him herself. She still wasn't confident that she would be ready to enter his level of society as he expected her to. If she went to see him now, wouldn't he think that she was giving up all hope? They were engaged, having ascertained their feelings for one another. However, Lydia had not yet reached the stage where she would understand that it was all right to confess one's fears and doubts to one's lover and want nothing more than comfort in return. The next day, having failed to muster up the courage to see Edgar, Lydia boarded a train with Masefield's maid. The scenery past the window consisted of vast layers of tranquil, green hills. Even within England, there was a particularly rich tapestry of fairy lore originating in Somerset. Though it was Lydia's first time visiting the county, it somehow felt as though she was returning after a long spell away. Perhaps it was because she could sense the presence of fairies in every unobtrusive hillock or thick, isolated forest that she saw. "You come from Somerset yourself, don't you?" Lydia asked the maid. Masefield had mentioned that she had let the girl go after she had expressed a desire to find employment in her hometown. "Do you know the Redshanks? Or you might know them as the Danes?" Her companion gave a puzzled frown but nodded all the same. "My grandmother told me about them once. She said that they've hidden treasure and that coming upon it would make one gloriously wealthy." Yes, they are real chatterboxes and liable to let slip about that treasure. But even if you were to glean any information from them, I would think twice before attempting to take the riches for yourself. If you promise them instead that you'll keep what you've heard to yourself, they will grant you one wish. "But Miss Carlton, it's just a fairy tale." It was far from a surprising response. The number of people who believed in fairies was steadily decreasing. Lydia let the subject go with a non-committal smile. The only circumstance under which it was safe to bargain with the Danes was when one knew the location of their treasure. It was unwise to make any request of them without holding that secret to give in exchange. It essentially unlocked their magic to the haggling human. But if that human instead made a request on a whim, the contrary fairies were likely to use that magic for much less pleasant purposes. The safest option was therefore to ignore any information the talkative Danes might let slip. The maid might well have heard the same from her grandmother, but she probably wasn't interested either way. "Miss Carlton, you're referring to the Vikings when you speak of the Danes, aren't you? If it is true that they were once in Somerset, then it's possible that the treasure they pillaged is hidden somewhere nearby." "No, I do not mean Vikings, although that is a common misconception. I mean the ancient fairies believed to have a connection to the goddess, Dana." "I see." It was just as Lydia decided to drop the matter, since the conversation was going about as well as she had expected, that the conductor arrived and saved her the trouble. She let out a sigh of relief. They would soon be pulling in at the station. As they alighted, the maid checked the clock on the platform. "We've arrived rather late, haven't we, Miss Carlton?" "So we have. And you have another train to catch, don't you?" The maid was due at her new place of employment immediately. The plan was for her to accompany Lydia to Lady Ortred's estate between her trains, but doing so at this point risked her missing her connection. "Yes, and it's the last train." She was looking rather guilty, and Lydia didn't see that there was a need to force her to come to the Countess's estate. The fairy doctor had been told that it would be nearly an hour's journey to get there. Surely it would be permissible to let the maid continue on her way, given the circumstances. Lydia decided she would take the carriage to the Ortred estate alone. The maid saw her to the carriage, which she took from the station by herself. Lydia couldn't see a single building, even after the carriage passed through the gate into the grounds. They continued through thick groves for some time. She was aware that country houses tended to be magnificent structures situated on impossibly large plots of land. However, she had also heard that Lady Ortred was a widow and lived alone, and it crossed her mind that to live in such an environment under those circumstances must feel all the more isolating. When they finally arrived at the house itself, she was greeted by a male servant, to whom she explained that she was there at Mazefield's request. He asked that she wait before disappearing inside. At length, an older woman in plain navy clothing emerged. "What's your name?" "Lydia Carlton." "Mine's Boyle." "Not Lady Ortred, then." "You'll be answering to me from now on." "All right." This woman must have been charged with Lydia's education. Instructing her new student to follow, she set off at a walk. Given the size of the estate, its corridors and stairs were naturally vast, but for whatever reason, Boyle instead started down a particularly narrow passageway. Lydia's dress wasn't especially extravagant, but a woman in a proper gown would surely find her frills and ribbons rubbing against the walls. And even Lydia needed to hold down her skirts to pass through. "Your last place must have been quite comfortable. Don't expect the same here." The glance Boyle threw at what was among Lydia's best dresses bordered on disgust. The fairy doctor had judged it polite not to arrive at Lady Ortred's estate overdressed. She must have overlooked something. Seems like there are a lot of maids who grow big-headed from being granted their mistress's hand-me-downs, but that doesn't happen here. First things first, you'll need to change into something more modest. Maids? Lydia still didn't understand by the time they had climbed a long flight of cramped stairs and come to what appeared to be an attic. "This is your room. Come to see me in mine once you've changed. It's under the stairs." With that, Lydia was left quite alone in the tiny attic room. There was a shabby bed by the small window, a writing desk and chair, and nothing else, for there simply wasn't the space for it. There was no doubting the fact that this room was meant for a servant. She wondered whether there had been a mistake. Or perhaps she had been assigned this room according to Lady Ortred's instructions. She endeavored to convince herself that this was part of her bridal education, or possibly a test to see whether she was suitable to marry into nobility. "Yes, her ladyship must have discerned that it will behove me to experience life as a servant. In any case, she mustn't let her dissatisfaction show." Both Edgar and Masefield were relying on her completing Lady Ortred's education and earning the Countess's approval. It was as she was affirming to herself her desire to succeed that the door opened, revealing an apron-clad maid behind it. She handed Lydia a similar uniform in silence. Then, she turned on her heel to leave. "Excuse me, but who is Miss Boyle, precisely?" "Mrs. Boyle. She is the housekeeper at this estate." "I see. She seems rather strict." "We must avoid idle chatter during work hours." The maid left promptly then, without giving Lydia a chance to ask her remaining questions. There was one thing, however, that had become clear. The housekeeper's word was law. It seemed that Lydia really was to be treated like a servant here. She couldn't help but be a little bit doubtful of Lady Ortred's methods, if that was indeed what this was. But pondering it would solve nothing, so she changed into the maid's uniform, left the room, and started down the long stairs again. "Dawdling, weren't you? You'll have to get dressed faster than that or the sun will have set by the time you get to work." Lydia shrank back. It had taken no time at all for her to earn a scolding from Mrs. Boyle. The housekeeper's eyes were sharp as she examined Lydia's clothing for the slightest speck of dust. The fairy doctor had put her hair up into plaits, feeling she ought to have it out of the way. Mrs. Boyle took one between her fingers and declared that they should be done up more tightly. "You won't be receiving special treatment just because you're a maid. I'll be putting you to work elsewhere when her ladyship has no use for you." It transpired that Lydia would be attending to Lady Ortred personally. It made sense if she supposed that the Countess had an ulterior motive in having her work as a servant. "Forgive me, but it was Lady Ortred who asked that I be hired as a maid, wasn't it?" Mrs. Boyle frowned as though it were a foolish question. "Of course it was. Now, I'd like you to deliver the tea to her ladyship. She takes it at this time every day, so you'd do well to remember that." "Yes, madam." "I should mention that her ladyship has been confining herself to her chamber for a number of days now. When she is in her chamber, you mustn't go further than the antechamber. Don't open the door, but announce yourself, then leave the tea outside it." "Why is she staying in her chamber?" Lydia asked, surprised. "Don't ask prying questions." "Yes, madam. When you serve her ladyship's meals or tea, you must always ask if there's anything else you can do for her. You must not address her at any other time, no matter how urgent things are. Do you understand?" It sounded as though Lydia wouldn't be meeting Lady Ortred at all, much less be given an opportunity to ask about this apparent education of hers. Not to mention that, from what she had heard of the Countess, she hadn't imagined for one moment that the woman would be holed up in her room. Masefield had spoken of her as a paragon of an upper-class woman. Though she had withdrawn from society after the death of her husband, she had continued her friendship with the royal family and was still well known as an excellent teacher of proper etiquette. She was supposed to be both refined and of an outstanding nature, the sort of person everyone could aspire to be. Perhaps, then, she was suffering from illness. But if that were the case, wouldn't she have refused to take Lydia on when the Duchess asked? Ever more confused about the curious and unexpected situation she had found herself in, Lydia took the tea tray and headed to the mistress's chamber as instructed. It was on the second floor on the southern side of the building. Once she had made it as far as the antechamber, she called out, "The tea is ready, my lady." Though there came no response, she could hear stirring from deep within the room. "Is there anything else I might do for you?" "No. Away with you." It was a much scratchier voice than Lydia was expecting. She had heard that Lady Ortred was around 40, but the voice sounded more like it belonged to an elderly woman. She grew anxious that the Countess might be ill after all. "Forgive me, but are you feeling unwell? My name is Lydia Carlton. I am here to study etiquette, and—" "Quiet. How dare you speak out of turn? You would do well to leave at once, lest you wish to face the consequences." Along with the shout came a violent kick at the door that made Lydia jump, and she hurried away at once. She couldn't for the life of her understand what was happening. Was the woman she had spoken to really Lady Ortred? Despite her doubts, it wasn't as though she could force the bedroom door open and let herself in. Even if she did, she didn't know what the Countess looked like. As she was descending the stairs, she heard a commotion from the reception room by the entrance hall. It seemed there was a guest, or perhaps guests, and Mrs. Boyle and a number of senior servants were off to greet them. "Excuse me, but could you carry that for me?" Lydia turned around to see that it was a black-haired girl who had addressed her. The girl was pointing at an ivory box in the reception room. "It's a lovely jewelry box, don't you think?" she went on. "I have decided to borrow it during my stay, so I would like for you to bring it to my room. My maid has her hands full already." The maid in question appeared to be the ginger-haired girl who was dipping her head apologetically. The box must have been valuable indeed. Roses were engraved on it, and it was bordered with silverwork. Mrs. Boyle looked anxious when Lydia lifted it with both hands. "Do be careful with that, Lydia. Lady Lucinda has the guest room at the end of the third floor, on the left." Lydia was still unused to her new role, but she managed a nod despite her continuing bewilderment. "I am going to rest in my room for a short while, Father." Lucinda was addressing a rather rotund gentleman. "Will you be coming down for supper?" "No, I haven't much of an appetite today." "Oh, well then, rest for as long as you need to." Lucinda was dainty and fair-skinned, and Lydia thought that her somber air only added to her eye-catching beauty. Even the way the girl slowly climbed the stairs was calculated as to make the hem of her dress sway most elegantly. Her maid followed as silently as ever. "Your name is Lydia, yes? Have you been employed at this estate for long?" Lucinda asked as they walked. "No," she faltered in her response. She hadn't come here expecting employment, so she hesitated to announce herself as a new maid. "Are you perhaps a relative of her ladyship's?" she asked, genuinely curious, but her question seemed to cause offense. "Goodness, you don't know who I am?" Though Lucinda retained a gentle tone, her smile was evidently artificial, and there was displeasure deep in her gaze. Lydia struggled with her response. Lucinda might have looked like the docile daughter of a nobleman, but perhaps she was rather haughty. Never mind. Lady Ortred is my dear aunt. Lord Constable is my father. Do be sure you do not have to ask again. I'm very sorry. Apparently, the noble girl deemed it unacceptable that Lydia should go another second without knowing everything that was impressive about her, and so she continued. I shall be debuting this year, so I have come in the hopes that my dear aunt can teach me all I need to know. Once I have her approval, there will be no one in society left ignorant of my worth. In that case, perhaps she would be beginning her education as a maid just like Lydia. Or perhaps not, since she was a relative and not a commoner marrying an earl. Unsurprisingly, the guest room that Mrs. Boyle had chosen for Lucinda could not even compare to Lydia's attic room. It was a bedroom equipped with a dressing room. The fairy doctor supposed that there really would be no greater affront to a noble girl than to expect her to work as a maid. And that isn't the only reason I have come here either, Lucinda went on. My fiancé will be arriving very soon. Is that right? We have been exchanging correspondence for some time now. He will be coming to discuss the proposal he made to me with my father. We came up with the plan together. My father would only be suspicious if he came to our home directly, so if we have him come here instead and pass it off as a coincidence, things should unfold much more smoothly. How wonderful. Father, however, is of the opinion that I am still a child. I am not entirely confident that the plan will prove successful. I am sure you have nothing to fear. He is your father, he ought to understand. As she spoke, Lydia was reminded of her own situation. She lowered her head to conceal her blushing cheeks. She had expected her own father to think her too childish to marry, but he had been surprisingly quick to grant his permission. He had said that she always seemed happy whenever she spoke to Edgar. As far as she was concerned, rather than making her happy, the Earl's presence still sent her heart into disarray. She could be all manner of things, from nervous to embarrassed to bewildered to irritated to completely overwhelmed. But her father's words had her thinking that perhaps that was what happiness was. That was why, despite not understanding Lady Ortred's intentions, she wanted to give her all to the challenge facing her. Yes, you might be right. I do hope I can rely on your assistance should things go awry. Lucinda was more talkative than Lydia had assumed she would be. Meanwhile, the maid by her side had yet to utter a single word for some reason. Would you put that jewelry box underneath the bed for me? Lydia did as she was told, wondering whether the jewels Lucinda intended to place within it were so valuable that they warranted hiding. When she stood up, she inadvertently met the other maid's eyes. Might I ask for your name? She tried. The maid's eyes widened in surprise before she shook her head slightly, keeping her silence. Her name is Annie. She cannot speak, Lucinda replied in her stead. Anyway, Lydia, can you tell me what sort of person my dear aunt is? I'm sorry. You may be surprised to learn that I have never met her. She and father didn't get on very well, so this is my first time coming to her estate. Father understands that her support will contribute to my future, so he decided to make amends. I have only just arrived today myself. Really? Why, that's a pity. I had thought this would be the perfect opportunity to learn all about her, seeing as she has been bedridden for some time now. I suppose you don't know anything about her regard necklace either, in that case? A regard necklace was a pendant decorated with a variety of gemstones, and the first letter of each of them spelled out a word of significance. As the name suggested, regard was the most conventional word spelled out on these types of necklaces, imbuing them with a message of affection and respect. I hear it is so splendid as to leave one wide-eyed, Lucinda said. My dear aunt has so much jewelry that she has never worn the same piece twice, and yet apparently that necklace is particularly wonderful. It uses flowers in its motif and contains hundreds of gems of 5 separate types. Have you not seen it? Lydia shook her head. She hadn't even been in the Countess's room. It was a gift from her departed husband. I was wondering whether I might borrow it when I go to the royal court. Lydia couldn't even begin to imagine the splendor of such a necklace. And high society was where so many of the girls adorned in such jewelry gathered. Edgar wanted to bring Lydia there and have her be a part of it, but she wondered whether she was worthy when she couldn't even provide her own dress, shoes, or accessories by way of a trousseau. Once she had started to think, she was struck by a possibility. Perhaps Lady Ortred had no intention of allowing her, a middle-class girl, to enter society's upper stratum. What if the Countess had invited the noble-born Lucinda and her fiancé here to show Lydia an example of what a proper aristocratic marriage should look like? If her ladyship had the fairy doctor working as a maid in order to teach her her proper place, then it wouldn't matter how hard Lydia worked, the Countess would never approve of her. No, that cannot be the case. I am sure she will recognize my efforts, if only I do my utmost. Lydia chased away the impending gloom by choosing to be optimistic and left Lucinda's room behind her. However, she was unsuccessful in concealing her sigh. This certainly wasn't the education I expected, she murmured to herself. Realizing she had spoken aloud, she checked to make sure that there was nobody nearby. Then, she sighed again. It was as she trudged along the hall's perimeter that she heard the sound of a carriage approaching the porch. Assuming another visitor, she directed her gaze outside the window. It must have been the gentleman whom Lucinda told her about. Vaguely curious, Lydia kept watch. The moment the carriage door opened and the man stepped out of it, she had to bring her hand to her mouth to stop herself from crying out. She was very familiar with his slender figure, even from the back, and how he was dressed flawlessly from the top of his hat to the tips of his shoes. Edgar. Flustered, Lydia hid herself behind the curtain. Presently, he approached the entrance hall with Raven. He wouldn't see her from this angle. What is he doing here? She tried to quash her agitation and remain calm. Just because he was here didn't necessarily mean he was Lucinda's fiancé. In fact, he couldn't be the man she spoke of. He was engaged to Lydia. Edgar knew that she had been planning to ask Lady Ortred to educate her. He might only be here because he had business with the Countess. Or perhaps Maysfield had been in touch with him and he was here to see how Lydia was getting on. Yes, he might be here to see me. The idea wasn't exactly cause for enthusiasm. She really didn't want him to witness her undertaking servant work. And, even if this was a vital facet of Lady Ortred's education, a part of her would rather not have to see him unless she was wearing something halfway pretty. Never before had she been so conscious of her attire, and she remained unaware of the fact that her feelings for him had deepened to the extent that she feared an unsatisfactory appearance might make him fall out of love with her. All she knew was that she didn't want him to see her as she was. Lydia rushed into the servants' quarters just as she heard a butler welcoming Edgar into the building. Edgar's meeting with Lady Ortred had been planned for some time, and he was still under the impression that Lydia wasn't due here until next week. Securing the good word of an older noblewoman was indispensable if they hoped for his fiancée to be welcomed into the upper classes. Edgar had never been granted the opportunity to meet Lady Ortred directly, so he had asked Maysfield to organize Lydia's education in his place. However, he had also wanted the chance to speak with the Countess face to face. Not only that, but someone of vital importance was due to be visiting this estate imminently. There were a number of threads that Edgar planned to bring together in coming here, but he found himself at a loss when he was informed upon his arrival that he wouldn't be able to meet with the Countess for some time. It was something to do with a chronic illness, apparently. However, he was caught even more off guard when it transpired that Constable also had a party staying here. The older Earl was likely still under the impression that Edgar had attempted to seduce his daughter. Lucinda hadn't seemed inclined to convince him otherwise. Edgar would have liked to have explained the situation to Lady Ortred before Lydia's arrival to avoid any misunderstandings, but it seemed there would be no chance of that now. He sighed as he looked over the estate's vast gardens through the window and murmured, "I wonder what Lydia is up to at the moment." Raven, as earnest as ever, checked his pocket watch. "I dare say she will be having tea." Lydia's timetable at Duchess Maysfield's estate was highly regulated, so the servant was likely to be right. "No, Raven. I was actually wondering whether I am presently occupying Lydia's thoughts just as she is mine." That, he hesitated, is a difficult question to answer. Edgar couldn't blame his servant. Edgar and Lydia might have been engaged, but he still wasn't certain exactly how she felt about him. He had worked hard to win her heart. Naturally, he believed that she did hold affection toward him and that her acceptance of his proposal hadn't just been a case of him wearing her down. However, he didn't get the sense that her heart was aflame with passion for him. For example, she had never declared her love for him, and he seemed to be the only one eager to be alone together or to be in physical contact with her. For her part, she merely seemed to be going along with his desires. It must have been because they were engaged now that she felt unable to respond with a firm rejection. But, Edgar thought, perhaps it didn't matter so much after all. Wanting more from her was nothing but selfishness on his part. It was enough that she was by his side. That ought to be the desire that trumped all others. It is a basic rule of romance that kindness does little to encourage affection. I suppose this is simply a natural consequence of having fallen for her before she did me. Previously, Edgar had enjoyed romance like it was a game to which he could apply certain principles. However, his feelings for Lydia were different. Though he wanted her to love him, he wasn't prepared to act as if his own love had grown cold to achieve it. The matter was settled by the fact that he enjoyed watching her try to act as a lover should, despite being at a loss. She was as dear to him at the height of her bewilderment as she was at any other time. He wasn't especially inclined to employ any of his usual tactics when it came to her. While he might have withheld kisses under normal circumstances, doing so in her case seemed like a ridiculous notion, and he was similarly loath to limit his time with her. That wasn't to say that he was entirely satisfied with the way things were, however. If only she would ask to see me, I would come running. Though they hadn't seen each other in some time, Lydia had yet to say she missed him. In that case, why did you not go to see her, my lord? Raven asked, slightly miffed at his master's inaction. I shall want to kiss her if I see her again. Was it not you who warned me against expressing too much keenness? Keenness itself ought not to be a problem as long as it remains within the confines of what Miss Carlton is comfortable with. Lydia is not uncomfortable in my presence, Raven. She is merely a trifle shy. I see, he responded hesitantly. And the more she expresses such shyness, the more tantalizing I find her. It is therefore unreasonable to expect me to restrain myself when she stands before me. She could, however, stand to look just a little bit happier about his affections. In the rolling gardens below, there was a maid drifting about the far-off shrubbery, her hair in plaits. She seemed to be lost. Unaware that he was watching his fiancée, Edgar found his mind wandering to Lydia, who had seemed similarly downcast as of late. There hadn't been enough roses to decorate the supper table, and Lydia had been sent out to the gardens to fetch some more. Unsure where they were grown, she had been roaming in search of them. These gardens are far too big. There wasn't even anybody around to ask where the rosebeds were. It was as she was reconsidering her options that she spotted a wild rabbit running through some nearby flowers. Excuse me, I have a question, she called, chasing after it. The rabbit stopped and turned around. You can see me. In fact, it was a fairy wearing a rabbit pelt. To an ordinary person, it would look just like an animal. I was wondering whether you might tell me where I can find the rose garden, Lydia said. The rose garden? Steal our precious roses, will you? I'm sorry, I don't wish to steal anything. Hogwash. Why else would a human be asking after the rose garden? The fairy, itself the size of a rabbit, thrashed about, the ears on its hat swaying, its brown furred cloak fluttering, and its large, rabbit-foot boots stomping. Its wild movements revealed the red hair covering its shins. It's a Dane. Lydia kept a close eye on it as she softened her tone. I am a fairy doctor. Me. That doesn't make you more trustworthy than any other human. Not one of them knows when to keep their mouths shut. No chatterbox like that is going to get into the rose garden. With that, the fairy vanished among the roots of a nearby thicket. Fairies are far more loose-lipped than people are, Lydia muttered to herself bitterly. Why are you talking to a rabbit? Panicked, she spun around to see a young male servant standing behind her. Oh, I wasn't. You were talking to yourself? I understand wanting to complain. Mrs. Boyle is quite strict. The young man was clearly taking an unauthorized break from his duties. His short hair and jacket were covered in grass and he smelled of tobacco. You're the new maid, Lydia, aren't you? I'm Billy, a footman. He had a rugged air about him, but there was something affable in the way his face creased when he smiled. It's nice to meet you, Lydia said. Billy studied her like she was a curiosity. Likewise, but I have to wonder how long you'll last. Most of the maids move on very quickly. Do they? Her ladyship's a strange one, isn't she? That's why the estate's always looking for new hires. Lydia wondered whether she was partly being used to alleviate the staff shortage. Billy grabbed her hands while she was thinking. These are very clean hands. I suppose you're a middle-class girl who's been forced into servantship for some reason? Honestly, there was no need for you to be sent here of all places. Lydia was swift in pulling her hands away. Where is the rose garden? She asked quickly. Just keep following that gorse-lined path. Thank you. If you will excuse me, I ought to return to my duties. Lydia rushed away. The path didn't bend for some time, and she could feel Billy's eyes on her all the while. Nevertheless, the rose garden emerged at its end as promised. Roses climbed up white stone pillars, creating an arch above her head. She took a step through that entrance and discovered a fountain featuring a statue of the Virgin Mary that was surrounded by countless flower beds. It was a beautifully tidy garden. But all of the roses had yet to bloom. Now that she thought about it, it was a little early for roses. She would have been better off going to the greenhouse. However, she stayed where she was, for something had caught her attention at the garden's far end. There was a tall tree, and from the gloom behind it came a faint glow in all the colors of the spectrum. Lydia approached it, her curiosity piqued. She squeezed herself into the shrubbery beyond the tree and soon found herself in a deep thicket where ivy entwined itself around the roses. As soon as she moved past that, there was a change in elevation beneath her feet. That was what she immediately thought it was, at least, but the very next moment, she was tumbling into what seemed to be a pitfall. The landing didn't hurt, because the bottom was covered in a soft carpet of grass. The pit itself, however, was a curious thing indeed. There were stone steps going up one side, so narrow that Lydia could only imagine fairies using them. The hole was just slightly deeper than the height of a human, and the rainbow light glowed only at its opening. It must have been a fairy spell designed to conceal the pit, visible to Lydia only because she was able to see Fae. And, at the far end of the hole, there was a long, deeply dug, winding trench. It was undoubtedly a fairy path. Now that she had found it, Lydia wanted to see how far it went. And so, she began to walk down it. The dirt walls on either side were covered with short blades of grass. The farther she went, the more the grass and the vines among it covered the area above her to block out the sky. The trench had turned into a green tunnel. Still, she continued. Eventually, she started to see a white light in the gloom ahead. Recognizing it as a probable exit, she upped her pace. Oi! What's your wish? Came a disembodied voice. Lydia could only assume it was a Dane that had spoken. Now that she thought about it, the one she had encountered earlier had lost its temper when she had asked for directions to the rose garden. I suppose there's nothing for it now that you've found this path. I'll grant you one wish, but you have to leave immediately. It sounded like she would be entering the Danes' territory if she went any farther, and like they wanted to chase her out. As a fairy doctor, however, Lydia was already well aware of what she ought to do next. She needed to ignore the fairy. It and its brethren were engineering a chance to cast a spell that would teach the intruder a lesson. The wish can be anything you want. Just say whatever's on your mind and I'll grant it right away. Any human who couldn't keep their silence at this point would be unable to enter the rose garden. The Dane she had spoken to earlier had said as much. Indeed, it was tempting to speak. Many people would voice their wish, even if they didn't believe it would be granted, simply because of the possibility that their desire would be entertained. But doing so would give the Danes a chance to cast their spell and lead to nothing but tragedy. Lydia kept her mouth firmly closed and took another step toward the whitish light. She had no doubt that the Dane's secret rose garden lay beyond. Countless roses were in full bloom beneath a layer of white mist. Each flower seemed to be emitting its own soft glow. When Lydia touched one, the cool, silken petals seemed to stroke her fingers gently in return. The rose's light was iridescent in a way that was reminiscent of seashells. Some of them felt like they were made of pure velvet. Others had petals as translucent as if they were made of glass. As Lydia progressed through the garden, the fairies and their presence vanished completely, as though they knew they couldn't stop her anymore. It was the perfect opportunity for her to wander as she pleased. How wonderful, she breathed. Her work forgotten, she stared at the flowers, transfixed. Well, isn't this a surprise? It appears we have a guest. Lydia turned around and was surprised to see a woman rather than a fairy standing behind her. I'm so sorry. I ought to have asked permission before entering. She was middle-aged with sun-kissed skin. She wore a straw hat and a dirt-covered apron, and held a watering can in one hand. Surrounded by the red roses and with a wreath of colorful flowers around her neck, she suited the garden strangely well. Please do not concern yourself with that. I am simply the gardener. Lydia had never heard of fairies employing a human gardener. I must confess that this is my first time meeting anybody else here. The fairy doctor was also surprised to find another person there. This rose garden belongs to the fairies, doesn't it? Naturally, the gardener was well aware of that. She nodded with a smile. You knew how to reach this place, I suppose? Yes. I am a fairy doctor. I didn't know fairy doctors existed. I assumed they were a thing of fairy tales. She studied Lydia curiously with light brown eyes before gesturing to a cabin in the corner. Would you care to join me for some tea? I only have rose tea, though, I'm afraid. I adore rose tea. Oh, good. I do apologize, but I didn't catch your name. It's Lydia. I am Virginia. It is a pleasure to meet you. Though Lydia had expected the cabin to be a practical structure for holding gardening tools, the inside was neat and tidy, and there was a charming selection of potted herbs and dried flower wall ornaments. It was like a small home one might find in the countryside. There was a comfortable warmth about the log table and chairs, and a ladder-like staircase led up to the attic, which suggested a bedroom might be hiding there. To tell you the truth, this is my home, Virginia said before Lydia could ask. Do you live by yourself? I cannot leave until a new variety of rose blooms. Do you mean to say you are trapped here by fairy magic? Virginia nodded and turned her gaze to a narrow vase holding a coral-colored rose. She went on to explain that she loved cultivating roses and selectively bred the flowers to develop new colors and shapes, all while managing the estate's rose garden. One day, the master, presumably the late Lord Ortred, had informed her that the fairies had their own garden somewhere on the grounds. I was told that I must wear this should I ever try to enter the garden in question. Virginia brought a hand to the flower wreath around her neck, and that I mustn't give voice to my wish even if the fairies asked me to do so. For a long time, I never believed that there was such a garden, until I tried following the instructions I had been given. Only then was I able to stumble upon this place. That was when I started to come by here almost every day. According to Virginia, the roses bloomed all year round here. The mysterious flowers would wither at once if they were brought back to the human world. Even the seeds wouldn't bud if they were sown outside. She expressed her disappointment at being unable to properly study such a rare kind of rose. Eventually, I wanted so keenly to be able to cultivate these curious flowers and watch them bloom from my own efforts that I expressed as much to the voice asking for my wish. Her wish had been granted, and she had become the Dane's gardener. The Fae were likely aware of her passion for roses and her skill in nurturing them. That was why they had warped her wish into a contract rather than subjecting her to the horrors of their magic. That isn't to say that I dislike what has become of my life. The fairies are ever so delighted when a new variety of rose blooms. That is when I am able to go back to the human world and my ordinary way of life. But I inevitably come to miss this place each time and return of my own volition. Presumably, she would likewise long for the human world again after a while and cultivate a new rose species accordingly. The tea had a sublimely rich fragrance. It was like a sigh from a rose that had just awoken and opened its petals. For a short spell, Lydia's tired, anxiety-laden mind was afforded some respite.